Now we'll talk about the control of hormonal secretion. The secretion of hormones is a very precisely regulated mechanism. It is primarily controlled by negative feedback, and hormones effects can be very short-living, so the effects could stay for only a few minutes, or as we mentioned, they may last for a few days, even after stopping making that hormone. Hormone secretions are very precisely regulated, and there are different ways the body can get rid of hormones. So these hormones that are made cannot keep on circulating forever. They are either excreted by the kidneys in the urine, or the liver will break them down using some of the liver enzymes, and that means that their metabolic products are going to be excreted in the feces. So what are the control sources? A very small number of hormones are controlled through positive feedback, and those are mainly hormones that are found within the reproductive system. But the main method of control of your hormones is through negative feedback. And negative feedback is a control mechanism in which high levels of hormones leads to a decrease in hormone secretion, meaning that when a gland starts to make a lot of its hormone, that high level of hormones is then going to tell the gland, you know what, you've made enough, you can decrease your hormonal production. So really the hormone the gland kind of regulates itself. And there are three methods in which that negative feedback happens. So we have what are known as tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that are made by one gland and it regulates the secretion of another gland. Or we can do negative feedback through the nervous system, where the nervous system can directly stimulate glands to secrete their hormones. The third way of negative feedback would be that a hormone leads to a change in the composition of the internal environment. So it leads to the change in the amount maybe of glucose or ions that are found in the bloodstream. And that could either stimulate or inhibit the secretion of certain hormones. So let's take a look at each of these individually. So in the case of tropic hormones, we mentioned that a tropic hormone is a hormone that is made by one gland and that it affects the secretion of the hormone at another gland. Most of the tropic hormones are made by the hypothalamus. So you can see here in this system, you have the hypothalamus stimulating the anterior pituitary gland, and then the anterior pituitary gland will make another hormone to stimulate a peripheral endocrine gland. So let's take an example. The hypothalamus can make TRH, which means thyroid releasing hormone. Thyroid releasing hormone circulates and reaches the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates it to make TSH. That stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, TSH, again, circulates in the bloodstream until it reaches the thyroid gland in the neck, and it would stimulate the thyroid gland to make thyroxine. Now that we have high levels of thyroxine, that thyroxine will inhibit the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus from making more TRH and TSH. So that is an example of these tropic hormones and how we can control them through negative feedback. Where now which are considered, this is your first gland, second, and third gland. So when the third gland actually makes its hormone, that could, through negative feedback, it will inhibit both glands number 1 and number 2. Now, what about the nervous system control? So this is under the control of the nervous system through nerves and action potentials and so on, where these nerves can stimulate an endocrine gland, for example, the adrenal medulla that makes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are the considered, hormones/neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system. When those hormones are released, they are going to circulate and reach their target cells, producing different actions. Because of these actions, through negative feedback, that would send a message to the nervous system to stop sending more action potentials. Okay, so that is your nervous system control. Now, what about the third kind, which are changes in the internal environment, where you have changing in the level of a substance in plasma? For example, after a meal, our glucose levels go up. So that hyperglycemia, so that is a changing level of substance in plasma, lots of glucose in our plasma. Hyperglycemia will stimulate the pancreatic cells to make insulin. Now, insulin will circulate to the different target cells like the muscles and increase the intake of glucose into our muscle cells. That will eventually lead to the action of, now we have lower glucose levels in the bloodstream. And that lower glucose levels is going to inhibit the endocrine gland, the pancreas, from making more insulin. So again, we have these changes that happen in the internal environment, meaning inside of the body, where changing in the levels of glucose, whether it's hyperglycemia that led to the stimulation of the pancreas to make insulin, and then when the cells took in that glucose, leading now to hypoglycemia through negative feedback, that again will inhibit the pancreatic cells from making further insulin. Now, if you look at that process that we were talking about, you can see that hormones really do not have a stable level throughout the day. It is more of a fluctuation because of that negative feedback. So your actual concentration of hormones throughout the day varies. It goes up and down according to the needs of the body. But if you look at the average concentration of hormone, that would be constant. Okay, so negative feedback really maintains a relatively stable hormone concentration, even though there is a fluctuation throughout the day. And that fluctuation is very normal. That is why, for example, if you want to find out what are the insulin levels of a patient, you really have to figure out, is this after a meal, before a meal, have they been not eating for a period of time, because you are going to be measuring the actual concentration of hormone. If you want to get an average, you would have to do multiple levels throughout the day in order to get that average. And this ends this portion.